Post-1948, when the Nationalists came into power, right through to the 1990s, photography has been seminal in telling the story of South Africa. And there's just a very strong tradition of what photography means and what photography is and how photography can be used.
We're in Roodepoort. We're doing a collaborative project, and the we is Rory Bester and I, who run a kind of guerrilla-style teaching project. This is a collaboration with PARI, which is Public Affairs Research Institute, and they've been doing a lot of research in these security complexes, housing estates, golf estates in the Roodepoort area.
I mean, my mode of photographing is about to change a little bit, but it's still stuck on how I've been photographed in the past.
You don't want to just be repeating yourself, and that's why I asked the question of place, because you have a mode. If you just extend it, then actually everywhere becomes nowhere, and then it simply collapses. It's not interesting. So it's not about necessarily being literal, but it is about at some stage we need to speak to the specifics of something about here.
The Roodepoort project is very invested in the world around us, in the way that photography was, say, in the 1980s. But whereas that photography in the 1980s was very much about advocacy and about overturning apartheid, this kind of photography that we're producing now is really around research and really trying to understand the complexity of the world around us. I think photography in the 1980s was dominated by the sense of the photographer as a witness, as somebody who simply recorded the world around them. And I think what's emerging post-apartheid South Africa, and it also coincided with a sort of rise of art photography in the 1990s, was this idea of the photographer more as a translator. And if you think about translation, it's about a relationship between two different kinds of languages. So it's really coming to a much more complex sense of what photography is in the world. And I think that's really what has been taken up by the art world.
Art in general is nothing else than a channel to understand the world and look at the world from a perspective that we wouldn't have thought about. Photography is particularly interesting because it seems so linked to reality.
When I started taking photographs, I was informed by the kinds of images that are published in newspapers, basically. And when I joined Afropix, I wanted to document good life in the township, which is my life. And the project that I started with was a kind of metaphorical biography about my own life, where I come from.
For a long time, I never considered myself an artist. Every time, it was like a swear word. You're not serious. You're an artist. We have as
documentaries where most of our photographers did start, and certainly Santu. Because, I mean, he started as a street photographer and then started working for a newspaper.
Documentary in this country was that if I made a photograph and there was a policeman, it's a good photograph. If there were two, it's better. If 3 policemen, that's front page.
It's very much the early 90s that Santu kind of started working as an artist. In South Africa, I think so many of the photographers still call themselves documentary photographers, and that's absolutely fine. I think you don't need to try and put it in a box and categorize it.
This been an exponential growth in sort of the vocabulary of photography. I mean, when I grew up taking photographs, you had to break down photography into genre to really understand its intention. You know, if it was black and white and in focus, it was reportage, and it was out of focus, it was art, sort of thing. I mean, I'm putting it crudely, but there were these broad lines whereby one would then try to work out what was the intention of the photographer. This has changed, and the vocabulary has exploded.
When I first started this project, I was thinking, how do I find my way in? And it's very difficult to be in a place when you're not really set up. So part of it is just driving around, and driving is very particular for me. I mean, driving is really a way of getting to seeing. Quite tricky. This is the kind of felt that you would not associate with high security complexes. You know, things can happen here. Yeah. And then the difficulty is then, how do you photograph this? Because there's not a whole lot of interesting visual material. We quite often adopt quite a passive relationship in front of photographs, that we expect photographs to give us information. I mean, they don't actually, or to tell us what's going on, and we accept the part as the whole, which it isn't. So I think quite often my emptying out the frame or putting things on the edges or being off is about destabilizing those kinds of expectations. I mean, it'd be interesting to see if I can get, but I feel like I need to get some height to look over that. So I want to see what's down at the bottom. My images are about how we look or what we look at, or how we value seeing.
Jo Ratcliffe is a photographer's photographer. Like, her work is loved by her peers. And she's also very recognized in the museum world because her work is understated. Her work is very sophisticated. The average collector might not be as taken by these bleak images, empty images where there is very little that happens, and one really has to look at the texture of the print. But the people that love her work are extremely faithful and collect in depth.
As photographers have moved into the art market, there has to be a consideration of the specialness of the image, especially in relation to this mass proliferation and production of images, and especially photographic images.
Where people used to put their money in gold and diamonds as another place to put your money, they're now putting it in art, which means there's been an explosion, which means there's been not only an explosion of collectors, there's also been an explosion of artists.
As a dealer, what we look for in a photographer is a language, a photographer that has his own language, that obviously draws from the tradition. It's virtually impossible to just invent something completely new.
I was moved with the opposite of what the city is, and looking at how actually space and buildings kind of tell a certain story about people.
Mack Magagane was the recipient of the Tillim Fellowship straight after he had completed his advanced program in photography. And that made him, first of all, I think, the youngest recipient. He then started to work with Jo Ratcliffe, his mentor, and he created a body of work called In the City.
I don't want to depict Johannesburg as what everybody sees, iconic images of Joburg. I see photography for me and how I speak with my work in a cinematic way, a theatrical way. Instead of speaking on one image, speaking on its own, what if you put images and create a narrative?
When I first started photographing, I really struggled to find a way of putting what I experienced in the world into one frame. And I think that's always provoked my way of working with narrative or image sequence or juxtaposition. It wasn't about having more frames or having a wider angle lens, but it was about a way of seeing that separated an experience of the world from an image of the world.
I worked in Johannesburg in 2005, you know, it's in the central CBD, worked downtown, sort of had this idea of making the portrait of the city, a sort of journalistic concept. You know, I'd photograph different aspects, put it together like a jigsaw puzzle, and you'd have a portrait. And at some point I just realized how absurd that was. I simply had to be in a place, and the place had to speak through you. But then the question arises, and it's a tricky question, well, who are you? When those pictures started selling, they did. Possibly the first time I really sold images. And I didn't know why. I mean, they were no different really from, or were they different from what I'd been taking? I couldn't really see it then.
I remember after 94, when the world actually opened to South Africa, people who were better placed to tell South African stories were artists. Being an artist, it was more important for me to find out who I am, what my place is in the world. And this I've been doing, this is my approach. It's personal, it's subjective. I don't spend my time looking over my shoulder. I take on subjects that actually affect me.
If Santu had to rely on the South African market keeping him alive, simply, it would not happen. I mean, we have a purely, I would say, 98% international support, because we are conditioned in our country to believe that an oil painting by Irma Stern is the way to go.
There's something about making and money that for me I find very hard. What's fantastic about having a gallery is that I don't have to worry about it. They do that stuff. I'm now starting to sell my work. It's fantastic, you know. I built a studio with a darkroom.
Ratcliffe was my mentor during my attorney fellowship, and also she continues to be not only a mentor but also a person like a mother to me, a mother figure who I consult with what new work I might have. I actually am able to share with Jo.
Mack is, or feels, quite loose in the way that he works. I mean, he has worked on a tripod, but a lot of the time he's shooting handheld. He works quite spontaneously. I mean, he's a kind of he walks his photography.
We're in Soweto, Ratcliffe. We'll be shooting southern suburbia. I was born in Soweto, but I grew up in Yeoville, in Johannesburg. From there, now I'm in Soweto, I'm based in Soweto. I'm creating my new work, Southern Suburbia, in Soweto. And I wanted to tell a different story about it. Soweto is just changing and redefining itself. complexes being built, malls, hence the title Southern Suburbia. There's always a stigma or stereotype that is associated with townships. And that's why I'm moving away from that. It's like, show Soweto in a different way.
A young photographer like Magagane that goes to Paris for a residency for 3 months can travel Europe, can look at exhibitions, museums, sculpture even. So inevitably the work comes out different, but because his references broaden. And I hope it's not because he looks at himself differently, because he tries to please a different public. But this happens in the art world at the same time, so we'll see.
There's always a risk with a young photographer when they get taken up by the international market that things are going to either just collapse or they're going to tailor their images to what the market wants, and they end up being a very superficial photographer.
I didn't really know what to expect when I got to Lisbon, you know. I'd never been to a show. I didn't really know how the openings really operated because I've never really been one to go to an opening. But Lisbon, the people were incredible and everybody was open towards me, and it was slightly scary. I think I was a bit pulled back and reclusive in some sense, but the work was received incredibly well.
When you look more seriously, you want to know that this person, first of all, has got talent, number one, and number two, will they be able to sustain their talent? Sustainability is probably the most important factor when collecting anything. It's like you have to look at the person and say, is this person sustainable in the craft that they have taken on? And when you look at older artists like Santu, they've already proved it to us because they've been doing it for so long. 26,000 negatives is what we've archived in the last 2.5 years.
The one thing I can say I contributed to is to make what was once considered a non-story, make it a story.
The aftermath of conflict is a more reflective space, so there is less urgency to document what happens, and there is space to actually look at the traces.
How do you photograph in the absence of that atrocity, 20 years after the fact, 30 years after the fact? I mean, with this Angola work, I've suddenly become an aftermath photographer. I was interested in space and the way space can manifest trauma and violence. That's always been my interest. The first visit to Luanda, I photographed everything, and all my pictures were crap, really. There was nothing really interesting. But there was a certain kind of moment in Roxantero, and it was a goat that was trussed up. And there was something about the goat trussed up, this group of women who were operating out of a container. There was bunting all around that looked like a fairground. And I thought, this is where Mad Max meets the Canterbury Tales. And the minute the thought came into my head and I had those two juxtapositions, I knew exactly where I was, and I felt at home, and then I knew how to see. I can remember a couple of years ago people saying, are you part of the new topographics? And it became quite upsetting to me that I thought, no, a war was fought here, millions of people's lives were irrevocably, this is not just some kind of aesthetic.
The worst thing you can do to yourself is allow yourself to be photographed. Because you are giving away license. You have no control.
I worked in a village in Malawi, very conscious of my projections of what I thought an African village should be, conscious of my photojournalistic roots, and so I sort of took a position. I just refused to photograph the sky. These were pictures of people, living in quite a precarious existence. And then I was printing up the image, editioning it, and putting it in a frame and selling it for thousands of dollars. And there's sort of there's a question there that you have to face at some point. I'm not sure what the answer is. And there sure aren't any rules. I mean, you just got to work it out for yourself.
Who are you in this photograph that goes out of our exchange or our relationship into a world where it then, whatever it does, whether it sits on an exhibition, goes into a book, gets sold in a collection, it becomes something else. It means something else. For Petrus, the soldier, who I barely know, who does he become in the world? Because he is not himself in that picture anymore.
What happened in South Africa gave rise to interesting art because of that kind of transition, that development of consciousness, which happened in surprising ways. In my case, distancing myself from the kind of propaganda I was involved in, feeding the appetite for a very unnuanced view of good and bad.
I never grew up in those times, and I never experienced apartheid. It's something sometimes I feel I don't want to talk about. We live in a generation where we're just trying to move away and just forgetting our past and just moving forward, I guess.
I do trust my work, and I don't mean that arrogantly at all. I trust what I'm doing, and I trust it'll be where it needs to be now or over time, and that's what I'm invested in. And I'm lucky because in some senses my fantasy is borne out. This fantasy that all I have to do is make the work, and someday somebody would pay attention. And there've been a series of some days. I have to make it worthwhile. I have to make it that when somebody pays attention, there's something worth paying attention to, and that there is a body there, and there is thinking there, and it has been sustained over time.
I guess for me right now it's still exploring, so I haven't found a mode particularly of how I work or what I'll photograph. It's just exploring. I still have a lot to learn.
I'm trying to make sense of my world. That's what I'm really trying to do. That's my role.
These pictures, even if they're about things, but they're also about me. In one way, I'm actually trying to write my own history about things that I care for, about things that concern me. If I die, at least you know my story because I put it down.